In this module, the focus is on entry and exit conditions into a market. So if you think of how sort of the modules have been laid out, we start with focusing on how do we define a market, how do we define how competitive things are in a market. We then talk about sort of the pricing and those sorts of things within markets. And now we're talking about shifting our focus from solely what's going on within a market to conditions to both enter and exit markets and strategies that could apply to either the entrant or an incumbent firm within a market facing potential entry. I posted some sort of background notes in terms of how common entry is and types of barriers to entering that stuff. Those things seemed fairly straightforward in terms of your ability to just read them and understand what we're talking about. But I wanted to save the videos for this module to focus in on a few different practices where there's a little bit of math in terms of when it would make sense and that sort of stuff. The first one is limit pricing. That's what we're going to focus on here. And then we'll move on to other ones in the next couple of videos. To give you a sense of where limit pricing fits in and what we mean by limit pricing, let's start with sort of a case study. So DuPont in the 1940s to 60s, so about a 20-year period, in the market for titanium dioxide. At the time, you could use either low or high grade ore in producing and refining titanium dioxide. DuPont was a little unusual within the industry. They had actually spent money, spent research and development, and developed processes to use both low and high grade ores. Almost all of its other competitors only invested in the high grade ore process because there's a expensive and steep 10-year learning curve for the low grade ore process. So all their competitors were focused on just simply the high grade ore process. In the 70s, the cost of high grade ore skyrocketed, and the EPA was developed in the early 70s, and they required costly pollution controls for some of the pollutants that were emitted during the refining and the processing, in particular the high grade ore process. So this was not necessarily foreseen in the 40s to the 60s. Then in the 70s, they suddenly find themselves with these extra costs, everyone that's using the high grade ore to produce the good. This gave DuPont a cost advantage since they had spent the time and effort and money into developing the process for both types of ore. They now had a 20% cost advantage over their competitors. And at the time, just keep this sort of tucked away, their market share in this industry was about 30%. So that's sort of where they were when this all went into place. DuPont, when they discovered that they had this 20% cost advantage, their management team initially advocated a maintain, or what they called a maintain strategy when you look at their internal documents, with constant prices and modest capacity expansion, projecting that their market share would increase to 37% in 1985. A couple years later, in May 1972, the task force advocated a growth strategy where market share would increase to what they projected to be 65% by 1985, and the executives approved it. So before we get to defining what limit pricing really is, let's think through what's going on here. So they find themselves with this cost advantage. Now, all the other firms with the higher costs, they're raising their prices. They have to raise their prices to account for the extra costs that they're incurring now that all these things have happened. So when DuPont, at first, they're going with a constant price. One could easily think that they could raise their price, maybe just not raised as much as their rivals, but raise their price and really take advantage of that cost advantage. But they're not doing that. They're actually keeping their price constant. And then in 72, when they go with a growth strategy, they're actually slightly lowering their price. So this is a little different than what one might expect, but this is where limit pricing comes into play a little bit here. Okay, so it's been concluded, and the executives have talked about this, how DuPont tried to leverage a short term advantage to strategically limit entry. And they used several strategies here that were highlighted in the notes for this module, and also we'll come back to some of this stuff. Limit pricing, which I'll talk about the definition below in a second, excess capacity, and exploiting learning curve advantage. Okay, so our focus here is really on limit pricing as a strategy. So, limit pricing is when you have an existing firm and they set a price that is lower than their profit maximizing price. So, if you think through some of the previous modules we went through and we calculated profit maximizing prices under different conditions, here they're actually going below their profit maximizing price, and they're doing that strategically. The thought process there is if you go below your profit maximizing price, you make entry less desirable to other firms. So if a firm's looking at coming into a market and they know that where your pricing is doesn't leave much margin for them, it makes it less likely that they're going to want to come in. So limit pricing is a strategy aimed at potential entrants, not existing firms, but potential entrants who could come into a market, and basically making the market look less desirable than it actually is. So you're going to produce more quantity at a lower price than what would be profit maximizing, but you're sacrificing a little bit of profits in order to keep competitors out. Because if those competitors come in, they're going to drive your profits even lower. And we'll talk through some of the math here in a second. But really, at the heart of limit pricing, it's just trying to make the market less attractive to potential firms that might come in and might want to compete with you within the market. Okay, so the Federal Trade Commission launched a monopolization case against DuPont. So obviously the other firms weren't happy with this. The DuPont had a 30% market share, and here they're talking about projecting getting to 65% market share by 85. So the other firms weren't real happy with this. And so the Federal Trade Commission, based on their urging, launched a monopolization case. So here's what the court kind of concluded. There was intent, but the conduct itself has to be illegal. Limit pricing is not predatory pricing. Now, predatory pricing is what we'll cover in the next video. Predatory is actually pricing below your cost and losing money. This isn't that aggressive. You're not actually losing money, so it's not an illegal practice. There's no evidence that DuPont planned to build excess capacity. DuPont was simply trying to take advantage of, and this is what they brought forth in the court case, some economies of scale and planning for future demand in terms of building up capacity, but it wasn't excess capacity where it was presumed to be sort of an illegal act. And so DuPont was acquitted, but the judgment left the door open a little bit. So the ruling states that strategic deterrence behavior may at some point cross the line and become unreasonably exclusionary. So these are all based on antitrust laws that have been around since the late 1800s. And so as these different business practices come about, the question is, how do they fit within the legal landscape of these antitrust laws? And so the ruling here said, look, limit pricing, trying to make a market look less desirable, doesn't cross that threshold into being anti-competitive and violating the law, but there is some point at which it would cross the line. Not limit pricing, but some point at which this type of behavior would cross the line. And we'll see more of that in the next video when we talk about predatory pricing, because that's been deemed to be a cross that line. Okay, so the question here that we want to focus the rest of this video on is, under what conditions would a firm actually do this? So the firm is sacrificing some profits to make the market look less desirable. So why would a firm want to do this? So the first thing we have to do is we have to recognize that this strategy is a forward-looking strategy. You're sacrificing some profits today in order to prevent future entry. And so when a firm is doing this, when a firm is looking forward and projecting what's going to happen in the future, and they're trying to decide whether it's worth it, we have to recognize that money today isn't the same as money tomorrow. Money today is going to be worth more than money tomorrow. And so that's going to weigh into how the firms decide things. And we'll talk through sort of how that works. But real simple, and you'll get this in a lot more detail in the finance class. But the way we know how money grows, so we could say that money tomorrow is equal to money today times 1 plus the interest rate. And you can use R or I, either one. So, for example, if you have $100 today and you have the opportunity to invest that at 5%, next year you would have $105. Okay, so that's all we're talking about here, and then there's compounding and all that, and we'll show sort of how this formula expands to that. But when the firm's making the decision whether to limit price, they're making the decision today. So we actually want to measure all of those future benefits in terms of today's dollars. So we want to basically take this formula and we want to rearrange it so that we have a formula for money today. So our formula is going to look like money today is equal to money tomorrow divided by 1 plus the interest rate. And as it compounds, that changes a little bit in terms of what it looks like, and I'll show you that on the next slide. But when the firm's making these decisions, when they're deciding whether to limit price, they're thinking, do I want to sacrifice money today plus money every period going forward, because you have to keep limit pricing? Or do I want to really take advantage of the fact that I have this short-term advantage, thinking the DuPont, I've got this short-term cost advantage, and maximize my profits right now, today, knowing that in the future, entrants will be attracted to this market and they'll drive that profit down. So you can see what we're weighing, and we have to consider when is the money hitting the firm's balance sheet. Okay, so here's our most general discount formula. So what we're saying here is this is the present value of a future stream of money based on the interest rate. Remember, I said you can use I or R. So this should look kind of like that term that we had before, but this is a more general formula that accounts for all different periods of time. So E0, so this is earnings or profit this period. So we don't discount that because it's occurring right now. E1, that's our money tomorrow, and we discount that by 1 plus the interest rate. We saw where that comes from on the previous slide. And then E2, that's earnings or profit in another year out, and we discount, and notice that gets discounted a little bit more because it's further out. And then this just continues on to where we get all the way to the end here, and here's earnings in period N, and that's discounted by 1 plus the interest rate to the nth power. So we're just taking like 100 years out. That money's going to be worth less to us than something that's 50 years out, which is worth less to us than money that's a year out, which is worth less than money today. That's all this formula is doing. So we want to take this general formula, and we now want to take this and make it work for limit pricing to determine under what conditions would a firm actually do this. Okay, so if we think about what they're doing when they limit pricing, so this is profits if they limit price. This is their actual profits today. This is their profits next period. This is their profits the period after. And this is that amount of profits they make that's less than their profit maximizing level that makes entry less desirable. And notice we're discounting the future period. So all we're doing is we're just saying, okay, how much profit will you actually make from limit pricing every year? And then we're just discounting that. And if the market's growing, the profit L's don't have to be the same. But we're being very general here. And then we can take the geometric or arithmetic sum and we get this formula. So profit limit is 1 plus the interest rate divided by the interest rate times that whatever that amount is that you're getting every period. So that's your benefit from limit pricing. If you don't limit price, you get the monopoly profit for some period of time, and then after a while, competitors enter the market. Since you didn't limit price, the market was attractive to those firms, and so when they come in, you get this amount, and we know that profit competitive is less than profit limit, which is less than profit monopoly. So that's the relationship between these, and then we're just simply discounting. So here's our formula for the present value of not limit pricing. You get this amount today, and then you get this amount going forward after the entrant has come in. If we combine all of these, we can say that a company will pursue limit pricing if the profit they get from limit pricing is greater than the profit they get from accommodating entry. And we've already solved for this and this on the previous slides. So really what we're saying is we need 1 plus I over I times profit limit. We're going to compare that to profit monopoly plus profit competitive over I. And if this is greater than, then they will limit price. If it's less than, then they would not limit price. And if they're equal, they'd technically be indifferent. So in order for them to limit price, we need the thing on the left to be greater than the thing on the right. Well, what's going to determine that? It's going to be determined, we said, monopoly profit's greater than limit profit, which is greater than competitive profit. Well, how close are they? If monopoly profit is huge relative to both limit and competitive, and especially if limit and competitive are really close together, then they're never going to limit price. They'll take the monopoly profit in the short run, and they'll just be happy with competitors in the long run. But if limit price is larger and closer to monopoly, and especially if there's a bigger gap between limit profit and competitive profit, then it makes it more likely that they will limit price. And it also is dependent on how they view the future. So I is the discount rate term. The larger I is, the less they value the future and the more they weigh the current. And so that's also going to influence whether they limit price or not.